But let me quickly introduce our three panelists who we all know quite well. Yakov Feygin is a money veteran, obviously, historian of Russian political economy, one of the great experts that I know, and he's been working at the Berggruen Institute, I believe, as director of Future of Capitalism program, if I got that right. Yep. Then we have Izabella Kaminska, who we all know, of course, from her capacity as editor of FT Alphaville. We had many interactions over the years. The big one was at the YSI Festival for New Economic Thinking at the Edinburgh Corn Exchange. She was on a panel with Perry there, and she was also last year at our Money View Symposium. So welcome back, Izzy, for that. And of course, Perry doesn't need an introduction in this forum. We will just go in the order, I would say. And the format is like open discussion. I think we're going to encounter some controversy, but I'm really interested in particular in Yakov's perspective here, because he is able to unpick here a bit what has gone on from both sides of sort of the curtain. The new Iron Curtain has emerged since the Ukraine conflict, and I would maybe offer the floor to him first. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's pretty natural to me why you asked me to do this, because I'm probably the only Money View historian of Russia in the world. There's like probably only one, well, probably two actually. I have a friend who also quite enjoyed the course. But, you know, I figured I could talk about Russia, but no, it's not really that much to do with the Money View. Talk about how at least the Money View has been useful to me as a framework, or as an analytical tool, both as a historian and now someone who, for their day job, has to talk about contemporary stuff. Because that's what I think it is. I think it is a useful analytical tool, or a useful set of priors that lets you kind of take data points and see them from a certain point of view, whether they be primary sources or the news or, you know, yields. So that's kind of, I think, what is helpful. So I think the first thing and I've kind of diluted this to, I guess, about like 5 or 6 points in my little notepad here as I kind of scrawled last night, of like what elements of the Money View and how I use it. So I think the first and most important element of Money View, I guess, as a group theory or group philosophy, is the idea that money is credit, and that credit is hierarchical. And that is really useful, again, to think about, because that means it's a dynamic system, and it's a system that exists in real time, because hierarchies move. Now, what I will throw out there, which Perry might not like as much, is I actually think that the Money View describes a very specific hierarchy, and one that I don't think economics knows how to deal with. And even I think Kindleberger didn't fully know how to deal with, in the sense that it describes a truly international rather than imperial system. Because before the emergence of the United States, we did have a multi-currency world that was tethered on different imperial polars. There was obviously the pound, but as we know in practice, the pound didn't have the power or reach of the dollar. It needed a lot more cooperation. There is, and I think Adam Tooze kind of gets at it in his Deluge book, though I don't think he makes it as explicit as he could. There is a qualitative shift in American power away from imperial power. And that is power that is truly transnational rather than imperial. It's a free trade empire. It's an ordering empire, and it's a financial empire. And it's also just so damn big as a unit that it is pretty much impossible. There's no really other place you can have the same climatic factors to mobilize that much coercive, real or financial, financial power, just starting with the size of the damn thing. So I do think there is a qualitative difference that gets us into a Kindleberger world, away from what I would call an Eichengreen world, where Barry Eichengreen has a much more kind of multilateral view of how key currencies work. And I think Kindleberger's is actually quite more hierarchical. And I don't think we're going away from that world. The real the real economy, the real impacts are just too darn large. There are huge sunk costs. The second point that follows from that, I think Perry does really well, and I guess Perry is someone who I basically consider my real advisor, taught was the state market nexus, right? That there is this kind of really hardcore neoliberal, let's say Austrian, even sometimes neoclassical view that, you know, markets are these decision engines, right? That come out with neutral outcomes. Then there is like MMT world, as we can call it, in which, you know, markets are only there by virtue of the legal, you know, legal power of the state. What I like about what I think is pretty key to Perry's thought in the money view is it's somewhere in the middle. And it's totally historically contextual, is that states are big, they can act and shape, and they can act, they can create, they can set the outside spread of markets, but that just depends on how big you are. And if you're not very big and you're not very high in the hierarchy, market can hit you back, right? And I think that's really important, right? All of these things are hierarchical. And, you know, the markets, states propose, markets dispose. That depends on how sometimes a market gets an offer you can't refuse, but sometimes it can, right? So that's kind of point two of thinking about the money view in this context, as I thought about it. Then point three, which is something I kind of brought into it, or learning into it, as I thought, not only through the Ukraine war, but through this larger crisis, is that banking is a supply chain. It is supply chain for money. Which is a little different from how I think Zoltan thinks about it, because Zoltan thinks that banking is payment chain, that supply chains are payment chains in reverse. I actually think they go in the same direction. And that's because I think in the macro sense, when you kind of put Perry and put money view in its like larger kind of universe of thought, it's a Keynesian philosophy, or at least a post-Keynesian one. So the growth driver, it's a Herod driver, it is demand. And money's role is to essentially facilitate the creation of that demand. So a banking crisis, a bank run, happens to happen when the supply chain is broken. Bank run is a run on a money supply chain, just like we can have a run on a real supply chain in the real world, as we've learned. And the thinner your supply chain, so if it's just in time, it doesn't have resiliency, it doesn't have a lot of reserves, it doesn't have strong network map behind it, well, they can, in times of stress, they can break really fast. Fourth thing I got from, I can say is important to, I think, understand how this system kind of works, is that there is, I think, a microeconomics to how Perry has taught us and thinks. And that microeconomics is the trainer model. I wish Alex Williams were on here, because he had like this pithy one sentence way of summarizing this thing, which is basically, it is a price setting model, micro price setting model, which doesn't depend on an equilibrium condition. It depends on a or like at least a general equilibrium. It is like a way of translating essentially Marshallian work into Marshallian will-informed dealers into financial market price setting. I found that really useful. And the more I kind of go along, and the more I practice as someone who works in policy and just has to think about ideas, the more I find the trainer model really, really useful. Because in a sense, all we are doing when we're doing state policy is we're seeing how far we can move around the outside spread. In some ways, like say, if you ask Rohan or any of the MNTers, they want to bring it into this. If you ask, I don't know, if you ask someone who's on the opposite side of that, they want to get rid of the spread, right? Completely. They don't want the state making the spread at all. But you can kind of understand the dealer market, not just in money, but in any dealer market, right? From as you, Perry, would put it, from oranges to banking, right? You can use the dealer model for anything. It's more obvious in banking because money is so fungible relative to other goods, right? So you can have these really smooth, relatively smooth transactions, and you can have reserves and you can have these movements really fast. But, you know, you can write a trainer model with frictions for, say, oranges. I don't think, I reread the paper last night and it just like, the math is really weird, right? And it's like, does anyone remember that paper? Like it's written, someone,
The Jack Trainer chapter?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. Yeah.
It's super weird, right? Because I didn't realize this until I kind of worked through it again, like with a like glass of wine, like trying to fall asleep. He's writing like linearly stuff that like we would write in covariates today. Which is like super nerd stuff, but that's actually I think pretty interesting because when I understood that, like, oh yeah, like you can just introduce frictions into the model and then you can basically use this for anything, because then you'll just have an extra error term or something, right? Anyway, this is all half thought out, but like, again, it shows how useful this thing is as a micro framework. So what do I take from all of this? I take it that I don't think we have figured out capitalism yet. Across the board, like we have in the money market. The money market, we've kind of figured out how to run a relatively smooth capitalism, relatively, because it's constantly evolving and it's very quick, but we kind of know how to deal with it, right? We have these things called central banks. We have these things called regulations, and thus we can kind of move the trainer model around. We haven't figured out how to do that for anything else. I'll give you my favorite example, one that I work on every day and makes me want to cry because it's like really shitty politics. Housing. We're really bad at building housing in capitalist economies without relying on a bubble mechanism. I'll give you a crazy statistic. In the United States, the only time since the 1950s when we had GI Act money flowing through, the only time we had an expansion in home ownership was during the 2000 to 2005 cycle. Only time. Because we use policies to work with the market to loosen the constraint. The only problem with that policy, which was an intentional one, this was what we called ownership society. George W. Bush wanted that as a political project, right? To build more Republican voters who were homeowners and property owners, is we didn't bail them out. We didn't set the, we let the outside spread be moved for us in achieving that policy goal. That could be applied to other things. I think Zoltan is right. We could have reserves of goods. But the whole point is, I don't think everyone can do that. I think that can only happen from the top down. Precisely because there is a funding need. And there is so much sunk cost into the reserves. Because the role of reserves, I don't think Zoltan reads this right, actually, if you read his sites. The role of reserves in a Herod or any commodity money system is to suck out volatility, right? It's to do the same thing the central bank does. It's to insert liquidity into a particular key market when it is needed by selling off the reserves and then setting a floor, a profit floor, to make sure those things are being produced by private producers. They have a profit motive by then buying those back at a preset option price, right? That could work. And I think this all will tie back to the Ukraine war and to a certain extent COVID. Because I think what this war is teaching us is that's actually possible. Powerful states can set that in a variety of markets. The first experiment and they're doing that with oil markets because the oil market is probably closest to the money market and its liquidity, right? You've seen the Biden administration, I think, quite successfully run a real corridor system for the price of oil. We've seen them not only release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but also also have an implicit option to buy it back at a set price, and that price is high enough that it doesn't kill off the incentive of the oil and gas industry to stop drilling 5 years from now. Because, like, I'm sorry, we're just going to need that industry for a while, even during the transition. It's a transition because it's staggered. And that's a powerful tool if we can explain that across markets. The other thing that if you've seen particularly in the last few months, which I'm actually shocked by how well it's working, is the Russian oil price cap. That thing is a nuclear bomb. It's never really happened before, and it's really showing that consumer countries, if they work together, have as much or even more power than producer countries. And there's been a lot of talk about how bad the Russian economy is going to get. I do think it's actually overperforming relative to how people expected. It's underperforming relative to how I think a lot of people think it's performing right now. There's a lot of fuzzy statistics coming out of it that if you dig into don't add up. And they're definitely starting to be cleavage points. But it's going to be really bad in the next few years because the real sanctions haven't actually come in until about December. Like the flow of Russian exports has basically been shut off around late November to December. So we haven't actually had an impact until late this year. It took a while for all this stuff to come in and for these systems to adapt, but they're being built. They are being built. They're built through crisis, just like we did through central banking. And I think that's really hopeful because if you use these things constructively and intentionally, you can get a lot of things done that might be pretty relevant with climate change. You can get quite a bit done. So that's what I wanted to say. I don't want to talk about Russia. I can talk about Russia if you're interested in the particulars of internal Russian political economy and factions and all that stuff. But I actually don't think that's useful for this conference except as entertainment. This is kind of what I think might be useful, what I took away from Perry in thinking about the situation.
Well, great, Yakov. I think that is very, very insightful. I learned a lot from this, and I have to go back and look at my notes a couple of times because there are a lot of points that I think we can really pick up. Izzy or Perry, who wants to go next? Who feels compelled? Perry, you have your mic open already. Is it you?
I think I left it open, but
I'm Perry.
What do you want? What do you say, Izzy? We were together in Zurich.
We were. I mean, what I would push back on, I mean, by the way, hi Yakov, really nice to see you in video form, by the way. What I would push back on is the idea that the price cap has been very effective. We don't know that. I don't think at all. We have had we've been lucky. The weather has been in our favor. So I think there was an overreaction in the markets early on, obviously. So we haven't had to test that price cap yet, is my view. So I don't think that would be my main response. But other than that, I mean, fascinating overview. I am sort of in the middle between Perry and Zoltan. I see both sides of the argument, and I certainly, I don't know if you saw Michael Pettis's, maybe it's already been discussed. Michael Pettis was pushing back quite relatively aggressively against the Zoltan thesis, saying that the dollar's not going to die for as long as countries have trade surpluses and need to recycle those dollars. And obviously, I think that is a very fair point. But I think the stigmatization of the dollar, I mean, I've been going on about this for a while, this neutrality issue, it is a new issue. And yes, there's going to be a compulsion to recycle dollars, and there's not many alternative options, but we've seen a big rise in non-Western central banks buying gold in the last quarter. That's come to the surprise of the World Gold Council, who I was talking to just a few weeks ago. So that trend is real. And in terms of, nobody ever considers, I think, how creative the system can get in the current situation, whether that means suddenly, will it be the case that rather than accumulating dollars that risk being confiscated, will China think about maybe using those dollars to write off the debt of emerging market countries? It's not optimal, but buying the favor of emerging markets in that way might be one tactic. Yes, we know there's default risk, and we know that China I mean, the defaults were higher than expected, and certainly it's not optimal. But this is about influence and geopolitics now. It's not just about the balance sheet. So I think the idea of going backwards to move forwards is now viable. And the other thing I would say is the idea of, I think these conditions create, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. And whenever we've had strict regimes, new markets have evolved. Crypto obviously came along. I don't think crypto is going to displace the dollar. Don't get me wrong, but there is lots of potential in terms of like how neutral countries might be able to stand in between some of these sectors. And I recently interviewed Andrew Hilton, who is a sort of London City veteran, I guess. And he used to work for, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Minos, the founder of the Eurodollar markets, Minos Banak. You know who I mean. Actually, here's the name. I did prepare it and then I lost it. Minos Banakis, that's it. And he told me an interesting story, which was that actually Minos was for a while not convinced that London should be the center of the Eurodollar market at all. Originally, he was thinking about putting I guess supporting the Brussels market, because he thought that would be the center of the Eurodollar market because NATO were there. And I thought that was an interesting snippet, and how different things might have been if the Eurodollar markets had like originated in Brussels instead of in London. Of course, there were other factors pulling things towards London, but imagine that. So in at the end of the day, dollar neutrality, if it's gone, I think some sort of substitute might come about. I don't know where from, but this is what I want to put on the table. Perry, I'm sure will push back.
Yeah, sorry, I left my mic on. I'm signaling, but that's because I have a very quiet place here, so I know that it's not going to interfere. So I have 4 points. Let me just maybe say, before putting my points on the table, maybe respond to a little bit of Yakov and maybe Izzy, just to start getting a conversation going, and then you can do your thinking while I'm talking, like in chess. You can do your thinking, speed chess, you on the other person's move. So Yakov, his first 2 points are basically hierarchy and hybridity, okay, which I always say are two of the reasons money is difficult. And I really appreciate, Yakov, your point about empire, which I was just talking to Quinn Slobodian for lunch today, and he said, you really don't talk about empire very much in that book, do you? I said, you're right. I had to finish the book, so you're pointing at the next place, so that's good. I really like your third point too. I think it's right about banking as a supply chain for money, not a supply chain in reverse. That's giving me very good food for thought. The trainer model as a microeconomic model. So yes, it is. However, I would, and this may relate to your point about capitalism. What I emphasize, Trainer intended it as a microeconomic model, certainly, okay. But when you move it into into money markets and then you realize there's going to be arbitrage across markets. There's going to be a global price of liquidity, and money and liquidity is going to move from one place to another. And you can use the trainer model to understand that. So I understand, the overnight rate of interest is a global price, and the term funding rates, these are global prices. So they're determined in the interaction between all the little trainer models in individual markets. So there's a macroeconomic, that's not Trainer himself, okay? That's me, using Trainer, who I discovered, by the way, when I was doing the book on Fisher Black, and I found Trainer and I said, this is what I've been looking for, in my money and banking class. Let me move this from securities markets and from micro into money markets and macro. That's basically what I do in the MOOC. This 5 and 6 points. Yeah, so that's moving forward and basically thinking about expanding this idea of dealer markets. I think I absolutely want to endorse that there are dealer markets everywhere. Okay, that this is a very, very general point of view, and it has well, you're talking about policy, and I always use it also about ideas. I mean, I say that I'm an outside spread guy. I'm not interested in being involved in Twitter warfare, but I will produce something that will move that Twitter warfare in a different direction because I'm creating an outside spread that will change the terms of the debate. That's my role. So I think thinking about who you are and what your personality is can help. Izzy and I have engaged before, so maybe let me jump right to Zoltan a little bit. Jay put the link to this is the document. Oh, it's not showing. Oh, it's my background anyway. It recognizes that that this is not a person. Okay. At any rate, it's very interesting reading. It is, however, kind of conventional. And the dealer model is nowhere to be had there. And it is so let me make my four points. First, yeah, weaponizing the dollar, I think, so this is about neutrality. I think it's probably not such a good idea. It has seemed to me that what we have learned from this is what I would have told the Treasury if they asked me, which is that money is pretty fungible. And that if you have a willing customer, there's going to be a workaround. So a lot of what we're seeing that Zoltan sees as sort of revulsion against the dollar, I think are just workarounds at the moment. So India is buying fertilizer with rupees. Why? The Russian central bank is not deciding to accept rupees as reserves. No, this is just bilateral trade, and they're just going to use the rupees to buy stuff from India. Okay, and the same with China. China's buying oil with RMB. It's not that the central bank of Russia is going to accumulate RMB. They're just going to buy Chinese goods with it. So it's bilateral trade, and that's an inherent limitation of it, right? That this is bilateral balanced trade. Okay, you can't use a surplus in one country to pay a deficit in another country, and so it's quite inefficient. And so I think it's not replacing the dollar. Actually, it's a workaround for sanctions. And so my second point. And he points in his article to other sort of straws in the wind of de-dollarization. I'll just point, and Izzy mentioned countries buying gold. Well, China is one of them. That's been in the news recently, and Russia has been, holding yen but swapping into dollars with private counterparties. I saw some articles about that. So I think a lot of this is really about finding a more reliable counterparty than the U.S. government, or finding a counterparty who the U.S. government can't shut down, but maybe in dollars. Okay, so I want to distinguish between shifting out of dollars and just choosing a different counterparty. Remember that the euro-dollar market was created because Russia was afraid of holding deposits in New York, and they said, "Oh, the British bankers will never screw us," So we'll hold them in London, and that was true for a while. And I think it surprised Russia, right? That basically Europeans asked for this, and the US did these sanctions. A third example, I mean, this is still point 2 about other de-dollarization. You saw in the FT last week about Brazil and Argentina talking about creating this sewer thing. This is also economizing on dollar reserves. Basically, there are sanctions in place here from the private sector against Argentina, right? Because they've defaulted on debt. And so here's a workaround. They're doing a workaround and trying to build bilateral trade between Brazil and Argentina. So so you're seeing these straws in the wind that Zoltan adds up and says they all add up to a sort of universal revulsion against the dollar. And I don't read that at all that way. Here, these are workarounds for countries that find themselves on the outs, and now they may be the seeds of something eventually, but assuming that the Ukraine war doesn't go on forever, there will be a time when you'll say, well, should we shut down this workaround? These workarounds are expensive and inefficient. So that's the point. Third point, I think we need to also appreciate what's driving a lot of this, okay, is current macroeconomic conditions globally, okay? We have been in elasticity mode for 10 years, zero interest rates in the global north, okay? And so all kinds of garbage, got funded there, because you never have the settlement constraint doesn't bind if the interest rate is zero. You can just roll it over. So now things are settling, and we're finding out. And so crypto is the first victim, and others victims have yet to fall. And all of this tells me that the dollar is strong, not weak, okay, and that U.S. monetary policy is global monetary policy, and that we're creating the conditions here of discipline on which a future growth will be built, okay, possibly climate change finance. You can't, you need to have a stable financial system in order to do the kinds of things we're going to demand of it, okay, going forward. So that brings me to point 4, which is about war finance. Okay, in a way, what Izzy was saying is necessity being the mother of invention. So Charlie would always say, war is a hothouse. Okay, where things grow really rapidly, right? That's what a hothouse is, where seeds can sprout, and it's particularly a hothouse in finance, because you're pushing your economy to the extreme, and all this stuff needs to be financed. And so you're pushing your banking system to extreme, and things get invented and along the way. And so just remind you in history of the way in which World War I was sort of, a financial sea change, and World War II is a financial sea change. So I think there could be things being developed. Some of the things that Yakov was talking about, thinking about, institutions for stabilizing commodity prices. Okay, so maybe that's right. That there's that war is a hothouse, and things are being invented that will then be used later on for other purposes. And so I would watch that space. I think that might not be the thing but other things are probably being invented too. So this is a time to be paying attention to what is happening. And the last thing I'll say about that is, hopefully we won't have an actual world war. Okay. But if we do, okay, just remember that what happens in actual war, okay, is that all private markets and private market calculations shut down, and political calculus drives everything, not commercial calculus. And so, that it's hard to start these things up again after they get shut down. There's skidding, moving from war finance to peace finance. We've already seen skidding going from COVID finance to peace finance. COVID finance is like war finance. Okay, we've been through that period, and all government budgets, look as if we fought a war. The debt to GDP ratios, and so this is the actual context of these innovations that are happening, okay, that I would keep in mind, okay, not some idea that the world is abandoning the dollar because they don't like dollar hegemony. I think that's not a broad enough frame. And I told Zoltan that. He's a friend of mine, and I think it's maybe the part building on this war finance. What I find really useful in Zoltan's stuff always is he talks to a lot of people, okay? And then he kind of tries to add it all up and turn it into a money note, okay? So what he is saying is what he's hearing, okay? And I think we should think about that, that a lot of people maybe want to believe this, maybe they do believe this, maybe they're floating trial balloons about this. That's what I would take and this is a little piece of evidence about what the conversation looks like, that conversations that I'm not privy to at all. Izabella is closer to that world than me, but are people going to tell her the truth? Maybe not. I think Zoltan's more insider in that world than any of us. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Let's have a quick responses by everybody. Yakov, you want to go first?
Yeah, a bunch of points, and actually, two of them, Izabella, are going to be like from stuff you wrote many years ago that I think is really useful. I'll get there. The gold thing and the Russian reserves thing. I agree with Perry on this. I think it's a workaround, and it's not a great one to begin with, honestly. I'm not sure if all of you were online when I was just telling like a story about my father-in-law, right? So just to repeat it, my father-in-law works for one of two companies that make certain kinds of equipment that you need to actually make microchips. And my father-in-law has a high school education that he barely finished, but he learned to do this very special kind of measurement approach in the US Air Force, which is where it was developed. He's like one of a handful of people that can do this. He has a multi-million-dollar ruler, as he calls it, that he flies around the world with to make sure that the inclines and the dimensions of the space in which the machine is going to be put into is not going to break the machine, because if it's off by even a micron or something, that's it. The precision is gone. These are custom built things. There's really good research on understanding global trade from a engineering systems complexity point of view. And what that research shows is that basically since the early 20th century, there are only 3 countries, maybe 4, that can produce highly complex systems: the United States, Germany, Japan, and the Netherlands, with some appearances in Northern Europe. And that hasn't changed. The only country that, though other countries have been moving up that chain, the only country that moved down the chain is actually Russia. Russia is worse at making complex systems in 1990 than it was in 1914. What that says, though, and what all those stories say, is that I'm not sure commodities are the narrow points here. And my father-in-law sure as hell, well, he might, because he's a crazy Trumper with some conspiracy theory views, might accept payment in gold, but he's sure as hell not going to accept it in renminbi. And he's sure as hell not going to be accepting it in anything else other than dollars. And that's kind of what all of these systems are trying to do, is they're trying to figure out a way to get dollars without dollars to pay people like my father-in-law, who can make these narrow inputs. And again, coming back to Russia, Russia's oil industry is screwed, not just because of the price caps, which, okay, we can debate whether they're effective or not. I've actually been shocked as to, I'll admit, like, yeah, we might not know yet, but I'm shocked at the rate of their impact on receipts. That's what I'll say. But they can't drill their oil without ExxonMobil being there, because ExxonMobil has a few of the right engineers that can actually get to their reserves. The Russian oil industry is in a long-term state of breakdown. That machinery isn't maintaining itself. What they're trying to do is to use the gold to trade and swap into dollars to get some of that stuff, and that stuff is increasingly hard to get. There's a huge, transaction cost to all of this, which is why you're going to see more and more, where you're seeing more and more rationing. Huge. So I kind of wish your colleague Kevin Gallagher was here to talk about China, because he's produced all this stuff showing that China's actually moving backwards in like its regress to emerging countries as they default. Because, like, again, if they default on all of that stuff, they're actually going to wind up with a trade deficit, and that can't work for them. That creates many problems for their employment system and social welfare state in general. So yeah. I see in the chat people are saying China cannot produce this stuff. This is why they're like reeling from American sanctions. China is not even close to that. France.
But China just announced, sorry to interrupt, Yakov, but China did just announce that it had made some massive advance on chip manufacturing. Was that, do you think that
Nano
was
something, yeah. Mhm.
I mean, they can try, but again, maybe they'll make the advance, right? Maybe they'll do it. The innovation is not dispersed, is like randomly dispersed, but
I would push back against that because, you know, China is where a lot of, I don't know, I'm not an academic, but from what I understand, like everyone is telling me that the days of when China was just copying everything are over, and that some of the best science is being done in China because they've got these sort of boundless limits on most things. I mean, yeah, okay, they might be doing gain of function, but they're also doing real experimentation and stuff that
I don't doubt I don't doubt that, Izabella, but again, speaking to China sources I have and speaking to China tech people, one, there's actually like been quite a bit of budget cut into there. It's no longer what it used to be. Two, they're really good at basic science, really good at basic science. They're not as good at they're really good at, but they're not as good at moving basic science into installation yet. That's kind of the key middle income trap thing, right? They can do a lot of really good basic science. They can do a lot of mass installation, is that middle layer that's always really hard for a country to move through. So,
but on the commodity thing, like I think what Zoltan is trying to say, I don't want to speak for him, but and I find this very puzzling why economists struggle with this idea, but like commodities are the input into everything. Yes, Russia might struggle to maintain its you know, oil output because it doesn't have the chips or whatever. You know, if China ever makes that leap, then it can buy the chips from China. But fundamentally the source point is the fossil fuel, and it's not that complex. You can always go to coal. There are this has been, you know, they've got these they have got the know-how. They haven't got the technical equipment every now and then, but they do have the know-how. And what the other point I would make about commodities is that even if you have a choke point, I mean, it's these choke points that there are issues, like whether it's helium or neon. Like the US does not have a monopoly on the access to all these very specific source materials. This is why we're seeing weird like fires breaking out in Russia for the last year in critical plants and blah, blah, blah. I'm sure it was all like Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, tit for tat. I wouldn't be surprised at that. I'm speculating here. But if you are going to have that source choke point, right? I think you need to acknowledge the fact that we aren't investing in fossil fuels. We've decided to embargo all that stuff, right? Because of the transition. So it's always going to be cheaper for Russia to develop its fossil fuels than it is for us to gain the same equivalence in energy input, because renewables are just not comparable, and we would have to build lots of nuclear plants.
I completely agree with you on renewables, right? And I mean, I think the real threat to the dollar actually isn't Russia de-dollarizing or other states de-dollarizing. I think it's, you put this out, I think you actually put this out a few years ago. It's that the US is increasingly becoming an energy exporter itself. That's like very bad for the dollar, more so than any of this. Where I totally disagree from you from an engineering point of view of talking to people who actually work in Sakhalin, which is the major, like even in the oil industry. This stuff isn't easy to get out. The easy Russian oil and gas hasn't been available since the 1980s. There was a legitimate energy crisis in the USSR. There's a great work about it called Crisis Amidst Plenty, which I think explains so much about the late Soviet period. There is a legitimate energy gas crisis in the USSR precisely because they're pretty sure they've run out of it.
Yeah, but my point is different, because as we embargo all these other very cheap fossil fuel sources that are still easy to get your hands on, you don't think the Russians will somehow find the means to get that? I mean, Rosneft is doing deals with the Kurdish, right? Because no one else will deal in that area anymore. I mean, so it's not just about their own fossil fuels. Of course, that is, and you're right. I wouldn't disagree with you. Like it is, you know, these are very complex cold weather systems, like the Siberian ones are incredibly complex, but they have other options, and you see Rosneft operating, they're in where we dropped our fossil fuels, Rosneft and the Russian companies are going to come in.
Absolutely. But again, I don't think we're disinvesting from fossil fuels that much. Two, we being the West. And two, like, I think fortunately with IRA, that delusion that we can end it overnight is gone. Two, like, Kurdish oil, that's not enough to set a price. Now we can argue Rosneft's goal isn't really to set prices. It's become a tool of foreign policy completely. But like Russia's size in the oil market, I'm using the market I know, only comes from the fact that it has a ton of it. And since the 1990s, they've been able to get foreign firms and foreign technology to extract it. I will tell you from a fact of people I know who are working in Russian fields or have worked in Russian fields, they are starting to have problems. Those rigs aren't rolling anymore. And what we should be looking out for, and this will happen, is when the Russian Section 31 is formed. And for those of you who aren't weirdos who know about things like this, there's a whole branch of the North Korean government that is designed to make methamphetamines in order to import sanctioned technologies.
Explain that. I don't know about this.
There is a branch of North Korean intelligence. I think it's called Section something. It starts with a 3 or something. I forget the number. But like essentially North Korea makes a whole lot of meth and other illegal drugs because they can. And yeah, Section 31 is from Star Trek. I forget the actual name of the North Korean branch, but something, it's got a number in it. But North Korea produces a lot of methamphetamines because they can. And the goal of that hard currency is to actually work within criminal networks to smuggle in goods that they need as intermediate good inputs. Now, the cost of that is massive. I don't know, but that's what you're going to see a lot more of in the Russian oil industry and in Russian oil and gas, is trying to get that stuff in. And they will, and I think they already are, at least from apparently what the Ukrainians are opening up, some of the newer, some of the weaponry they're blowing up, and they're finding stuff that looks like it's been smuggled in. But, can you do that at scale and be a major exporter? I don't know.
I mean, it's bringing it back to the money view. I just think there is, if we pursue our quite increasingly acrimonious sort of relations with China, then there is a risk that, it's a perfect swap. China needs the commodities and Russia needs the Chinese tech, right? So for them not to align in that environment, I would be very surprised. Now, China doesn't necessarily have the know-how to develop deep sea Siberian fields or wherever they are, but there's, they have the capacity to poach talent and to make, there's going to be a market in people. The idea that this, we live in a globalized information economy. The idea that, these skills are only going to be resident in one country is weird. Really, it's the business management structures that can, like you were alluding to, it's the structures that are going to do those countries have the means and the discipline to bring these giant projects about. But China, if any country has the means to bring a giant project about, perhaps not on the quality level of the West, but it does have the means. So I'm just pushing back a little bit, but I do think that Zoltan's point is fundamentally that whoever has the cheaper energy source is going to have an advantage. And especially when you think that most of our renewables, especially on the solar side, are made in China, and they're made in from coal-fired energy most of the time. So there's a deep-seated irony here, and I think with the IRA and the subsidy war that the green subsidy war that's going to evolve, that's going to be another dimension to the unraveling of the dollar. Because Perry, I'd love to have your view, because this is the first time I've heard economists arguing that a subsidy war is a good thing. Is that plausible?
Well, we aren't exactly normal economists here.
But that was the message I was hearing, is like, in this case, because it's a green subsidy war, it's self-limiting, and you know the product is going to be great green stuff. But when you throw any like huge amount of money at any industry, then I'm presuming the same, like green is not in some way immune to scamming and all sorts of bad allocation. Because if the tech is not there, you throw money at it, you might get it, but there's no guarantee, and you don't know that maybe you're misallocating into this sector and you should be putting it into another sector. I don't know. I'm just wondering whether that's going to have an implication on the dollar itself as well.
Well, I'm a consumer of information about this sort of thing, not a producer. What I will underline again, because you were talking about, you know, this natural trade between China and Russia. Okay, let's just remember that this is got to be balanced bilateral trade. Okay, so that it is, and this is the case for Brazil and Argentina as well. Okay, so to take some of the geopolitics out of it, I mean, that's why I talked about Brazil and Argentina. Just think about that. You know, once they have a currency union, suppose they do, you know, that is going to be an incentive to increase the amount of bilateral trade. Okay, so that and we trade shifting, right? Argentina cannot buy from people who demand being paid in dollars, but they can buy from Brazil, who doesn't demand to be paid in dollars. But what are they going to pay with? They have to pay with some goods that Argentina produces and gives to Brazil. That's the same problem that Russia is going to face with China. That's the same problem they're facing with India. That there might be the quantity of bilateral trade may increase. Okay, in both cases. Okay, and that's trade shifting from other places. And of course, you know, there's hysteresis here. Once it shifts, it might stay there. You know, because you learn that, oh, you know, these people actually are reliable suppliers of X, Y, and Z. And so there could be, we are creating hostages to fortune for the future. Okay, I just don't think they're about the dollar. I think they're about trade patterns. And similarly about, you know, I've said in public, you know, at Bloomberg and again in Zurich, you know, that yes, we learned that supply chains just in time are ridiculous. They're too fragile.